Welcome. We are waiting a few moments to allow people to log on, and we'll get started at 9:02.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Ram Manik Kalinga. I direct the Dialogue Advisory Group that's based in Amsterdam, and I will be chairing today's webinar in memory of David Petrasek. The topic of the webinar is human rights in the time of COVID. Although my organization is based in Amsterdam, I spend most of my time in Colombo, where I am right now. And you will notice the setting sun is up there on my right-hand side, and it's about 6:30 p.m. in Colombo. I also know that many of you are joining from very different time zones. For some of you, it's early morning, and you're just having your morning cup of coffee. For others, it's late night, and you're trying to stay up. And others of you are interrupting your working day to join us today. So thank you very much, and we're very grateful for the massive interest and presence of all of you here. My job is to walk you through the program of 2 hours, help introduce the panels, and help moderators keep us on time. This seminar is to honor David Petrasek. David represents the very best of 3 worlds that many of us here today are associated with. He was an activist for human rights and for peace. He was a scholar who wrote articles and taught many students. Above all, he was a mensch, a decent human being who made sure that the decent part of all of us came forward, even as he understood that there was a less decent part that he recognized with his own wry sense of humor. Let me briefly walk you through the program. Today, we will begin with a few words from David's life partner, Christine Bloch. After that, we have 2 very exciting panels. The first is chaired by Alex Nev, the Canadian director of Amnesty International Canada, where David spent quite a bit of his professional life. This panel will begin with a message from Michelle Bachelet, the current High Commissioner for Human Rights. It'll be followed by an engagement or discussion between 3 former human rights commissioners, Mary Robinson, Louise Arbour, and Zaid Al-Hussein. They will discuss the current challenges in human rights. Following that, Archana Pandya, who is the co-founder of Open Global Rights and also its senior director, will moderate a second panel of scholars and activists. They are Ignacio Saiz, Alicia Yaman, and Saul Takahashi. After each panel, we will take a few questions. The questioners, but not the questions, have been pre-selected due to practical considerations. With several hundred signing up, I have to confess I was wary of the challenge of picking and choosing questions and questioners. However, We very much welcome audience participation through the chat function. That's easily accessible to all of you and will also be accessible to the panelists as well as the questioners. And so kindly engage directly with the chat function, sending messages if you wish, privately or publicly, for everyone to view. We also call on all the panelists to mute their microphones when they are speaking. After that, we will come to the final stage of the program. Omar Sabri, one of David's students, will also speak. I believe he's hiding out in Patagonia. And finally, Alan Rock, former president of the University of Ottawa, also a former Canadian ambassador to the United Nations, and a former Minister of Justice and Health in the Canadian Cabinet, will conclude the seminar. Let me begin today's proceedings by calling on you, Christine, to speak. And thank you very much for joining us. We know it's a very hard time for you and for your family, and we are grateful for all of your support for David and for all of us, and for allowing us to be a part of your family during this very difficult period. Christine, please.
Thank you, Ram. First and foremost, I would like to welcome everyone to this online forum on human rights in COVID times. The forum is in honor of my life partner, David Petrasek, as Ram said. And it's a beginning of a wider initiative to honor David, which includes setting up the David Petrasek Legacy Fund and a possible series of lectures to come. I believe Alan Rock will talk more about this initiative later. We have a great mix of human rights David was
Christine, we have lost your sound.
Oh, my sound should be on.
Oh, now you're good. Now you're good. Maybe just go back a minute or two because we had lost you for a bit.
Yeah, David was very adamant that he did not want a memorial service with big speeches after his death. Always want to enjoy a good conversation over a good meal. He instead wanted us to hold an open house for people to meet and share stories and ideas. Because of the pandemic, we've not been able to follow his wishes for such a gathering yet, though we hope to do so when it's possible to gather in large groups again. This forum for us is in a way an opportunity to remember him and to carry on where he left off, and we are so grateful for it. David was extremely devoted to bringing people together to discuss the future and challenges in achieving human rights for all, and to ensure human rights respond to the challenges we face as human beings in a changing world. The last blog he wrote was about not seeing human rights inflation as a problem, but rather as an expression of new interpretations of human rights that respond to new struggles for human dignity. He was very aware that COVID-19 would pose new and reinforce old challenges for human rights and struggles for human dignity. His last work, only a few weeks before his death, was to commission a series of blogs for Open Global Rights to explore human rights and COVID-19. Today, we will continue this exploration in his name. On behalf of David's family, our children, Annalisa and Mikael and myself, I want to thank everybody for participating today. And in particular, I want to thank all the individuals, institutions, and organizations who made this event possible, the organizers, the moderators, and not least the speakers who've agreed to share their ideas with us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Over to you now, Alex, for the next panel.
Thank you so much, Ram. And I guess I'd like to begin first by noting and acknowledging that I'm joining you all around the world from unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory here in Ottawa. and that as well, this territory was David's home for more than a decade as well. And his own commitment to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples was something very deeply felt. And we carry that spirit into the forum this morning and beyond. I also want to thank Christine so much for those poignant and very thoughtful opening words. It has truly given us the right beginning for this session today. The Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, as many of you will know, was established 26 years ago in 1994, an outcome of the World Conference on Human Rights the previous year. And in the lead up to that World Conference, Amnesty International was an active champion of the need to establish a High Commissioner for Human Rights. And where was David Petrasek in those days? David was working at Amnesty International. So on this opening panel, beginning with a video message from the current High Commissioner, Michelle Bachelet, and then hearing directly from former High Commissioners, Mary Robinson, Louise Arbour, and Zeid Ra'ad Al Hussein, we have 15 of those 26 years of wisdom and experience collectively in one place. That is more than 1/2 of that history of global human rights leadership. Friends, it truly is a remarkable opportunity. And the fact that they have all generously and without hesitation given of their time and wisdom is a true testament to the esteem in which David is held across the human rights world and the impact that he has had. Our very dear colleague, partner, teacher, mentor, co-conspirator, and for many of us, longtime and special friend, David Petrasek was very many things. One thing he was in overflowing abundance was thoroughly humble, never looking for the spotlight or seeking accolades. So he would no doubt look askance with that crinkle of a wry smile that many of us know well at the news that such a panel of luminaries is coming together in his name. But then he would immediately engage with how valuable a session it would be, how timely, who should be in the room, how to frame it, how to leverage the discussion, and how to position it in this particular moment, which offers perhaps an unprecedented opening to shape and advance a transformative global human rights agenda. So anticipating David's advice, we knew therefore that the theme for this upcoming session had to give space for timeliness, for urgency, for opportunity, with both practicality and idealism in play. So we have asked the High Commissioners to share their reflections with respect to a simple but profound two-word question: towards change? Of course, these exceptional individuals need no introductions. Their biographies are included in the background materials available to you. We are going to hear first from the current High Commissioner, Michelle Bachelet, who joins us by way of a video statement, and then from 3 of her predecessors in the order they held office: Mary Robinson, Louise Arbour, and then Zeid Ra'ad Al Hussein. First up by video, Michelle Bachelet.
It is a privilege to speak at an event in honor of David Petrasek, whose integrity and commitment to human rights was truly remarkable. David was a true thought leader for the human rights world, and we will sorely miss his insights, energy, and vision. He would have seen the current COVID-19 crisis in its full dimensions for civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights, including the right to development. I think David would have agreed that we urgently need to empower more advocates for dignity and human rights. I feel strongly that we must not miss this opportunity to rebuild the public's understanding of why human rights are important and work to ensure that everyone can express that support and participate in decisions. The pandemic has starkly exposed the harm done by gaps in human rights protection. People have been called on to wash their hands, but 2.2 billion people have inadequate access to water and sanitation. People have been told to stay home and remain physically distant, but 1.8 billion people live in grossly inadequate and overcrowded conditions. We have seen how critical it is to have universal access to affordable healthcare and social protections. We have seen the lethal impact of racial and ethnic discrimination against Afro-descendant, indigenous peoples, people of color, Dalits, and ethnic minorities. We have seen many governments respond to the pandemic by imposing even greater control on freedom of information, expression, and media freedoms, criminalizing criticism, shrinking the civic space, and restricting privacy. But governments need the broadest possible input and participation to devise accurate and effective measures to prevent and mitigate the pandemic's harm. COVID-19 clearly demonstrates that respect for civil and political rights, including people's right to criticize governments' pandemic responses, are beneficial to everyone. It also shows in a painful detail that failure to uphold economic, social, and cultural rights hurts us all. And I believe this can and should invigorate our advocacy for a broader civic space and far stronger human rights-based action. I hope we can encourage many people to join this great venture of rebuilding our societies with more just, more peaceful, and more sustainable and climate-friendly systems. Without a doubt, David would have been at our side, generating innovative and far-reaching ideas and mobilizing others to participate. He saw the need to engage not just states, but non-state actors and businesses as well. We miss his curiosity, his conviction, and his determination to tackle obstacles no matter how challenging. But I, for one, am inspired by his example and his contribution to our movement. And I hope you will join me in this memory to strengthen our struggle to uphold human equality, rights, and dignity for all. Thank you.
So from a distance, obviously, thank you to High Commissioner Bachelet for those opening remarks. And now I would like to turn things over to Mary Robinson to kick off the live part of this session.
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to join the High Commissioner, dear Michelle, and my colleagues Louise and Zaid in welcoming this tribute to David Petrasek. And I fully and wholeheartedly agree with everything the High Commissioner said about David, and indeed about the impacts on human rights under COVID-19. I'm going to speak about how business and human rights has evolved. David Petrasek was already part of the team at the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights when I arrived in September 1997. And we first met really when I sat down with the small unit that was dealing with business and human rights that also included Scott Jerby. And David emphasized to me the very real negative impact that business was having and causing such human rights problems. In many ways, it was an eye-opener to me because I hadn't looked at that area closely before then. I was, I must say, a little disappointed over a year afterwards when David told me that he wanted to move to the newly established International Council on Human Rights Policy. However, I had indeed welcomed the establishment of the council, and I knew that David would have more time to write there, and write he did. In 2002, the International Council on Human Rights Policy published a major report, Beyond Voluntarism, and David Petrasek had steered it from its conception really to its publication with a very significant number of contributors. Earlier, Kofi Annan had launched the UN Global Compact in Davos in January 1999, and the office was given a key role, which I interpreted as trying to push the Global Compact to set some real standards for business and not be part of a green rinsing or a blue rinsing. The UN Subcommission on the Protection and Promotion of Human Rights Working Group had produced a draft of the norms on the responsibilities of transnational corporations and other business enterprises and respect to human rights. But although these norms were welcomed by a number of NGOs, they were really contested by the business community. And eventually the Commission on Human Rights ultimately determined in 2004 that they had no legal standing. So the field was quite contested at that time. And in 2005, the Human Rights Council requested the appointment by Kofi Annan of a special representative of the Secretary General on business and human rights. And of course, Professor John Ruggie was appointed. I had established a small NGO called Realizing Rights by that time. And my colleague Scott Jerby, who had come with me from the Office of High Commissioner, worked quite closely with the team of Professor Ruggie in developing the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And once again, I remember clearly, we pushed John Ruggie to take more seriously human rights, which he did eventually. However, as time has passed, this, what I would call soft law approach, has been felt not to be adequate at the moment. And in 2014, the Human Rights Council agreed to establish an open-ended intergovernmental working group mandated to draft a binding instrument, a treaty, in other words, and that work is still ongoing. Meanwhile, the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights established an annual forum on business and human rights, which does convene ever more numbers of business, and its significance has been growing each year. And indeed, business and human rights has begun to flourish as an academic subject. It seems strange to name only one, but I name Mike Posner in the Stern Business School in NYU as a very good example of the kind of expertise that is working now on business and human rights. And my own modest involvement also continued. A few years earlier, I had been persuaded by John Morrison to be honorary chair of a business group that he had established, which was called the Business Leaders Initiative on Human Rights, or BLEAR, as we tended to call it. And this in turn led to the establishment in 2009 of the Institute for Human Rights and Business, of which I became the founding chair, with John Morrison as CEO. And the team also included close friends of David Petrasek, including Salil Tripathi and Scott Jerby. I should mention that you will hear that I'm chair of this and chair of that. Of course, when you're chair of something, everybody else does the work, and then you come in as chair and often get the credit, but that's the way it is. After a few years, I handed over the chair with pleasure to John Ruggie, but I agreed to remain on in the Institute as patron. And this led unexpectedly to being asked only 3 years ago to chair a broad steering committee, which arranged and managed to evolve into the Centre for Sport and Human Rights under its able CEO, Mary Harvey. I also chair the International Advisory Network of the Human Rights Resource Centre. And over 10 years ago, I was asked to lend my name to a speaker series they were going to organize each year in New York during the UN General Assembly week. I must say, I'm very glad that I did lend my name, because this series brings together frontline defenders on issues of business and human rights. And I have sat and listened to very harrowing, very moving, very courageous stories. And they remind us of what business and human rights is really all about. So in my short intervention, I was told to make it short, what I've tried to convey briefly is the incredible dynamism now in business and human rights, which had an excellent root in the report Beyond Voluntarism, which had been David's early passion and is so much part of his legacy, and so important now with COVID-19, that business is held to account using the guiding principles and other norms and values on human rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mary. That's a powerful beginning for us. And I'm now going to hand things over to Louise Arbour.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alex, and welcome everybody, wherever you are, to this really splendid event. If you will allow me to indulge in a side comment of a more personal nature, I'd like to take this opportunity to congratulate Mary Robinson not in her capacity as former High Commissioner for Human Rights, but in her capacity as former President of Ireland, for Ireland's splendid victory in obtaining a seat in the UN Security Council. As a citizen of a country who lost out on this battle, all I could say is beware what you wished for. But congratulations anyway. I won't say much at the outset about the fantastic contribution and legacy that David Petrasek made to the human rights movement, but I hope that my remarks will illustrate, I think, what Alex has already pointed out, which is the remarkable talent that David had to bridge, and this is what I will come to at the very end, to bridge the efforts that many in this room and in this audience, I think, are engaged in, that is, in developing a strong normative framework for human rights theory, human rights advocacy, and on the other hand, the more field-based advocates, human rights defenders, and actually citizens who come to realize the importance of their rights in their lives, and increasingly, and I'll come to that later, seem to be willing to claim these rights. And I think David's work has illustrated that very strongly, this necessity in the human rights movement to come together on this normative framework, and at the same time, on the immediacy of ensuring that in the most concrete, fundamental way that rights are protected for individuals and for groups. So we were asked to reflect on, towards change. Are we in a time of change? And maybe I could situate that in my reflection a little bit on the time of my tenure as High Commissioner for Human Rights, which was 2004 to 2008. And I think when I look back on that, I think we could ask ourselves fairly, have we reached in the last, or maybe a decade ago, the kind of high watermark of human rights, not just aspirations, but momentous change from the creation of what then the Human Rights Commission. So in the international framework, in civil society, the growth and strength of civil society organizations. So is this all behind us, or are we just about to see it reinvent itself in a, I suggest, possibly a profoundly significant way? So let me just remind you a little bit of why some might think that the sort of 10 years ago might have been the high water mark of the international human rights movement. First, we saw the transformation, for those who are addicted to institutional examination, we saw the transformation of the Commission on Human Rights into the Human Rights Council. And this was quite significant. It brought together diplomats in particular in New York and in Geneva to reflecting as to where the human rights system sat in the UN machinery. And very significantly, we hoped at the time, it created the Universal Periodic Review. I stress that because for me, the concept of universality has always been very important. And as much as some are dedicated to a kind of more singling out, naming and shaming type of exercise in human rights advocacy, I felt that the necessity to appear at least to be fairly examining everybody's behavior was more of a guarantee, I think, of the capacity of reaching out and making real change. So we had the creation of the Human Rights Council with the UPR system. We saw the growth of fact-finding, mapping, mission, so a real kind of examination of what was happening on the ground, a continuation of norms refinement, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, people with disabilities. It was still action on the normative side. My own personal failure to reconfigure and unify the treaty body system, but at least it generated some conversation on that. And then more broadly, we saw the growth of transitional justice, responsibility to protect, very ambitious ideas at that time. And there were lots of small victories, I think, and serious setbacks, particularly after 9/11, a frontal assault on some fundamental norms like the Convention Against Torture. But all in all, some may look back and say, These were the heydays, and maybe since then there's been some sliding back. So this brings me to where are we situated? I'm just trying to check where I am in time, which I've lost. Alex will remind me. Where are we with the pandemic? And let me just try to bring together three streams or features that this pandemic, I think, has highlighted in terms of human rights. The first one, of course, is the importance of economic, social, and cultural rights, which in the Western world in particular is immensely important because this is the branch, the big branch of human rights that the Western countries had, for the most part, either neglected or never really embraced as being part of the human rights system. So in particular, the right to health, but I think the entire framework of accessing public services and so on as a fundamental human rights has been put to the forefront in a very significant way. The second aspect, I come back to my previous comment about the pandemic, is the idea of universality. If you compare the impact of 9/11, for instance, on human rights and the pandemic, in 9/11 was very divisive. It was us and them. We, the good people, potential victims, and then the terrorists. And that generated all kinds of, in my opinion, yielding to extremely unhelpful policies. We surrendered a lot of our liberty or the liberty of others to increase our own security. The pandemic has highlighted its truly universal aspect. In this one, each one of us is both, at the same time, a potential victim, and I don't know what word to use, but a potential perpetrator, a potential carrier of the virus. So we are in a universal, very equal position vis-a-vis each other, and I think that's very helpful to advance a human rights discourse. And finally, discrimination. I mean, it's been apparent that old people, minority people, people with inadequate financial means, inadequate access to healthcare in country, and then between countries, the discrepancies, again, unfair, unjust, discriminatories have become very obvious. And finally, adding to this complex but full of opportunity environment, we've had the Black Lives Matter movement and this very strong movement addressing racism. The point I want to make on this, and it's on that I want to leave this conversation and invite you to reflect, and to reflect on how David would have helped us think of these issues. I think both in terms of the pandemic and the racism issue, what is critical is to bring together what I would call this street movement, street democracy, with those of us, and I suspect there's many in this room, who have traditionally worked more in the kind of normative framework, development of ideas. And to give you an example, I think it's critical that we don't let our effort to understand in sophisticated way what is happening actually impeach or impair this street movement. And the best example of that is the debate that is taking place, certainly in Canada now, about whether or not there's systemic racism. We understand what that means, but let's make sure that we don't let language and norms become a firewall or an obstacle for the endorsement of what is, I think, a fundamental cry for change by people who own these rights. So I think what David would have said, what we need to do now is to make sure that we don't live in a bubble of norms and norm refinements and seminars, but that we stand with, and I would suggest behind this street movement, that we accompany it and we do nothing in our efforts to be helpful to actually give pretext to others to block what I think is a fantastic opportunity for rights holders to actually stand up and claim their rights. So I will leave you on this, I hope, hopeful thought. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louise. Indeed, a phenomenal tour and a hopeful note, and a shout out of thanks for that rapprochement between Ireland and Canada as well. You accomplished a great deal. And I am now going to turn things over to Zaid Rad Al Hussein as our next speaker.
Thank you very much, Alex. I am truly honored to be joining the High Commissioner, Mary and Louise, to be following them in offering a short analysis on whether we dare imagine this is a moment for change, and to try and borrow from David's own precision of thought, his brilliance in dissecting what it is that we need to do, when it is that we need to do it. When I was elected High Commissioner, I think David was quite worried that this diplomat was going to take on this prominent role. And so he advised that I be sort of loud. Being the clod that I am, I think I took him too literally. And I think what he really meant is to be loud and clever about it. And then by the end, I think he thought that I listened to him too carefully by the time I finished. So is this a moment where we imagine things changing? And I was asked by you, Alex, to look at whether or not the changing structure of conflict will allow us this moment. Will it give us the bandwidth necessary, the time necessary to make adjustments to the normative architecture, building on what Louise was saying, drawing strength from grassroots movements as we've always done, but now to the nth degree because of the street demonstrations we've seen on the back of the need to do something on racial discrimination. And can we build upon the deficits that are glaring? I mean, they're so glaring in so many countries. So can we build upon this by reinforcing the need for an extra investment by governments in the lives of their people, ending discrimination, deprivation, and ensuring a dignified living for all? Well, three things worry me from the conflict perspective. One is that we do see an escalation between the US and China, a dangerous escalation, not just emerging from what we've seen in Hong Kong, but possibly it could move to Taiwan. And this seems to be the case whether or not Trump remains as president or Biden comes in. There seems to be a grand coalition in the US that favors taking a hard position on China. And China itself, you know, its blood is up. And we saw this clearly with Hong Kong. If there is such a confrontation, it will suck out the oxygen internationally. We will all be consumed by that. And I think we have to keep an eye on it. Two, we have these chronic and sometimes acute conflicts from whether it be Kashmir, whether it be the situation we see in Burkina Faso or the Sahel writ large, or potentially between Iran and its neighbors, plus the United States and Israel. And that could also be utterly chaotic, given the fact that the machinery to manage, not least sort of resolve these issues, is crumbling and doesn't fill us with a great deal of confidence. And then third is whether or not, on the back of COVID, the economic pressures, the fiscal burnout that many countries will now experience with surging unemployment, and then when you couple that with the restrictions on civil society, freedom of expression, and then low consumer spending globally, because COVID is going to run for a while, it means that those areas adjacent to conflict situations are likely to be inflamed as well. And so we'll have a radiation of the instability outward. And then all the pressures that we've seen on vulnerable communities will be accentuated beyond anything we can imagine. And so in this space, while we see an opportunity, can we possibly find bandwidth to do anything if we're going to be potentially overwhelmed? So in the final analysis, so much depends on whether Trump is elected or re-elected or not. China is, I think, it has a separate dimension with the US, but on the other issues, I think we can expect that a Biden administration will be focused inward, yes, and it will have to take account of the social inequalities, the whole issue of race in the US. And that could also inspire changes outside of the US, which very much fold into what it is that we want to do, what it is that David very much would have wanted to see. And so the opportunity beckons if Biden is elected. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Zaid. A great way to wrap up that tour through three very important reflections of the global human rights scene. I'm now going to turn things over to three colleagues who are going to pose a question to each of you, and we'll hear from them in turn. And first is Roland Paris, who's a professor at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. Over to you, Roland.
Thank you, Alex. I hope everybody can hear me all right. And thank you to the former High Commissioners. This entire event is a testament to our friend David's work and life, and your participation in this event means a great deal. My question is for Mary Robinson. You touched on the importance of holding business to account during this crisis, and that's a very important issue. And in some of our the chat window, a number of people have been talking about this. But of course, the pandemic has exposed the harm done by gaps in human rights protections in many areas, and it has been exacerbating differences of income and race and gender and between migrants and refugees and more settled populations. So my question is open-ended and maybe difficult. Where do we start? All of these human rights areas are interconnected, of course, but how should human rights champions focus their efforts when there is so much urgency across so many different areas, given the limits to what our last speaker called the bandwidth of our attention? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ronan, for the question. And as you said, it's very broad, but I will address it. How I see the way in which COVID has affected us, it's like a mirror, which is exacerbating all the inequalities and the intersection between those inequalities, be it poverty, inequality, race, gender, being a migrant refugee, being a person with disabilities, being a girl now out of school who'll be pushed into child marriage, being in an abusive household, all of them. And so it has somehow made it clear that the business as usual before COVID was not adequate or satisfactory and had many, many gaps, as you pointed out. So I see it as being a need to combine the elements of how, if you like, in the words of the UN, we build back better. What does that mean? It means we have to shift towards every country and city and corporation committing to be zero carbon by 2050 and work backwards. So it's that direction. It means that we have to focus on biodiversity, but it also means we have to focus on racism. We have to focus on inequality. And I think I would support a point that Louise made very strongly. We need to both support the street movements that are there and also try and unify them. I mean, to too great an extent in the past, we've been in silos for human rights, for the environment and conservation, for racism, for minority, you know, there's been too much of a divide. Whereas we are seeing, and I'm seeing on the corporate side, some real reflection now, which I possibly should have gone into more. I kind of ran out of time doing too much historical stuff, but I am seeing much more reference to the responsibility of corporations to a wide range of stakeholders, including their employees, including the community they work in, including, you know, a responsibility for respect for human rights, etc. And this is important because they're also thinking in terms of committing to zero carbon by 2050 and what this means. So COVID-19 has jolted us out of a system that wasn't working. Business as usual was not going to solve the climate crisis. And I was very worried last January that we were heading for a lack of ambition in the COP26 and all that that would mean. COVID-19 has somehow turned everything, put us back to reflect in our homes. And the last thing I would say, to add to the very good points that Louise made about COVID-19, I would say it gives us certain strengths in realizing that the collective behavior matters. That's what's preserving us from the COVID. It's our willingness to comply with lockdown, social distancing, hand washing, etc. Secondly, government matters. We will see the impact of bad governance. Thirdly, science matters, hugely important. And fourthly, compassion matters. We're seeing a lot of neighborliness. So these are elements that I think make me a little bit more hopeful, funnily enough, than I was in January, with all the difficulties we're in, as has been well set out.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. And once again, an intervention that ends with some words of hope. Our second question is going to come from our colleague, Katya Papajani, who is the Director of Policy and Mediation Support at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue.
Thank you very much, Alex, and thank you very much to the panelists for these wonderful presentations and for joining us today to remember and honor our colleague David Petrasek. I wanted to pose a question on the impact of the pandemic on populations living in conflict-affected countries. And this is in the spirit of David's work and commitment both to the human rights community and human rights work and to the peacemaking community and mediation fields, which is where I met him. So we have, of course, seen that the impact of the pandemic has been very serious in countries affected by conflict. And we can expect that the socioeconomic and other consequences of the pandemic will be felt for years to come. So it will be very interesting to hear from Louise Arbour. What are the ways in which the human rights community and the mediation community can work more strategically together in conflict-affected countries? We have had aspirations for such collaboration and cooperation in the past, but there have always been obstacles in the road, it seems. So it would be fantastic to hear your insights on this and ways in which we can be more effective and have more impact if we work together in these countries in the context of COVID. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me. Yes, am I back on? Thank you, Katya. I think you've touched on a very challenging issue. For the reasons I think that Zaid, for instance, has elaborated, I think governments, Western governments, are going to have a lot of trouble establishing priorities that would be including financial contributions that will be necessary more now than ever to reach into the development and conflict management, conflict resolution portfolios. There's going to be enormous pressures for spending at home. It's going to take, I think, huge advocacy internally to persuade the traditional kind of donor community and even at the political engagement level. I think that what you've described is an environment in which, if anything, the risks are enormously increased, if only in part also because of the distraction of media. I mean, we don't hear anything anymore about what's happening in refugee camps. So it has disappeared from the day-to-day media attention in environments where help could be coming from. The human rights strategies always suggest that, as Mary was talking about changing for better and so on, the human rights agenda would always say, just make sure that when you embark on policy development, you always put principles of transparency, inclusion, but also putting the most vulnerable first. This will have some resonance, I think, inside countries like Canada, where attention to the elderly, for the attention to the extremely poorly paid healthcare workers is now at the forefront. But how to translate that to the kind of attention that's going to be necessary to reach out to the more vulnerable, much more vulnerable populations very far away elsewhere. In particular, for instance, we've heard virtually nothing about the effect of the pandemic on Africa as a continent, at least in the media environment in which most Canadians live their day-to-day lives. They just sort of assume that doesn't seem to be quite there. All the figures are about, China, US, Europe featuring and of course us. And the rest of the world, Latin America is surfacing. So I think this is going to require, it's a challenge. It's going to be enormously difficult to live up to mobilize. And it's incumbent, I think, again, on people like the people who are in this room, who have the networks and so on, capable of reaching out to government to mobilize the resources that will be necessary to reach these communities. But it's probably, and we have to remind people, when I said this pandemic, I don't like to say it's the great equalizer. It's equal opportunity. I don't think that's the case at all. It's extremely discriminatory, but it is universal. And I think we need to repeat time and again, no one is safe until everybody's safe. And that means inside the country and between countries. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for the question and for the answer, Louise. And our final question comes from John Packer, who's the director of the Human Rights Research and Education Center and also the Neuberger Jessen Professor of International Conflict Resolution at the Faculty of Law at the University of Ottawa. Over to you, John.
Well, thanks, Alex. Dr. Al-Hussein, the coronavirus pandemic, as we've heard, has pulled back the curtain on all manner of inequities and inequalities throughout the world. It is at the same time encouraging to see mass movements, especially youth, protesting against systematic and systemic racism, including the persistent residues of colonialism. Yet it's also deeply disturbing to see rising nationalism, populism, and exclusionary regimes, which have caused Freedom House to report 13 consecutive years of democracies in retreat. Recently, it was reported that the UN instructed its own staff members not to join in or express themselves with regard to Black Lives Matter or similar movements, invoking the idea that the UN and its staff should be neutral. Of course, the UN Charter nowhere prescribes neutrality. Indeed, the UN Charter is decidedly in favor of human rights, explicitly being against discrimination and for equality. Belatedly, the UN changed its position and became more accommodating of the staff's freedom of expression. But the confusion was unhelpful, whether as a matter of policy, in terms of international law, or as simple morality, not to mention the damage caused to public perceptions and confidence. These COVID times call for clarity of thought and determined leadership. Your career, in particular as High Commissioner for Human Rights, as you already made reference, was marked by your outspokenness, by your readiness to take a stand. Can you comment on the challenges of addressing the prevailing clashes on these issues of the need for effective advocacy for human rights at this moment of global tumult and uncertainty? And can you tell us what needs to be done to get better leadership? Thank you.
Quite a few questions packaged into one, John. Thank you. There are a number of different points. I think the very strength of the street also carries a weakness. Once it begins to fizzle out, you need a determined leadership, an identifiable leadership. And the liberal movement is not good at leadership. We don't like having leaders. We're actually leader resistant in many respects. And that's the strength of street movements. But they then fizzle and they're weak in themselves. It's like a net, you can poke holes and rip it quite easily. So then how do you find an effective leader in the form of Martin Luther King or someone who will magnetize the movement around a calculus which works and then can be transformative as opposed to just bits and pieces? Because on the far right, they're often very well organized. And a classic example of this is the Spanish Civil War. And you see between 1931 and 1936, on the left, it's chaotic between we have the anarchists, you have the syndicalists, you have the communists, the socialists, the liberals, all sort of more or less fighting one another. And at the start of the war, that's clearly what was happening. Whereas on the right, between the church, the conservative groups, and the military, they were much closer in thought and in unity. And that's the fundamental problem that we're dealing with. Human rights people fundamentally don't like to be led, and yet they need to in this critical moment. And on the other side, when you see yourself as defending the rights of people, which is what the extreme right all think that they're doing, because they defend a very narrow band of the populations,
I'm on a Zoom
the rights of those people, but not the rights of everyone. So I think we have to, and then finally, I do think, and I do look back at my own conduct, and I think maybe, I, taking a leaf from David's book, I should have been sort of not so much humble in the use of words, but humble in the tone when I would denounce actions by others. Because in the end, no one wants to hear it from someone who seems to be, self-righteous and pompous. And in that sense, David was very much smarter in understanding that they will hear it from someone who's humble as opposed to someone who's launched diatribes from a pulpit. So I think, now that we're celebrating his life and his contributions, his major contributions to human rights, his very example is a gold star, or let's say a lodestar for the rest of us in terms of how to get the message across. Do so with humility. And this is something when I look back on, I should have done more of, I think.
Thank you very much for those reflections, including personal reflections, Zaid, and for the question, John. And that brings us to the end of this first tremendous session. And I, on all of our behalfs, want to thank, firstly, of course, Michelle Bachelet for having joined us by a video statement, and then Mary Robinson, Louise Arbour, and Zaid Rad Hussein for those incredible reflections and interventions. I was madly trying to keep notes of all of the various topics that you managed to touch on in your sort of shared 25 minutes or so. And it truly was a tour, both historic and across a wide range of very important human rights imperatives and challenges as we move forward. You touched on human rights concerns, obviously, but importantly, you all have reflected upon how we need to catalyze movements and advocacy, build bridges, make connections as we move forward in this very important time with so many imperatives in front of us. Reminders of past imperatives, such as the aftermath of 9/11, and then current imperatives like the climate crisis, like the sweeping concerns now to finally address systemic racism, and of course, everything that's been laid bare by the COVID crisis. So thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us. And for doing so in the name and in honor of our tremendous colleague, David Petrasek, who would already be starting to think about, okay, what next? How do we build on it? And who amongst all of those great speakers am I going to get to write a blog post for Open Global Rights? He truly would feel humbled, but very engaged with everything you've put in front of us. So thank you so much. And I'm going to turn things back to my colleague Ram, who's going to keep us moving forward.
Thank you, Alex. And thank you to Mary, to Zaid, and to Louise for a very stimulating engagement on this issue. I thought in the spirit of David, I would just make one comment on the previous panel. David was very good at highlighting the silencers in the conversation. And there was actually one remarkable silence that many of the commentators from the participants have highlighted, which is the absence of any of the high commissioners, although 3 were women, speaking about gender or women's issues. And I think in particular, there were 2 aspects of gender that I would just highlight here. One is the very tremendously successful women's leadership in dealing with COVID. We all hear about Jacinda Ardern, of course, the New Zealand Prime Minister, but the Kerala Chief Minister, Health Minister, a woman, Shailaja, very successful in a situation with limited resources, but through effective and great organization. And then not to mention, of course, the Finnish and Norwegian Prime Ministers, all countries led by women that have been extremely successful in this. So it's something to note, to remember, to emulate. And the second gender point that was also raised was related to the Me Too movement and the tremendous amount of activism that revolved around it. That has, as Louise was mentioning earlier, and I think it was Mary or Zaid, all of them mentioned the risk of these movements fizzling out or not being able to actually change institutional power structures. And so I just wanted to raise the gender issue because I think there was this silence, and in channeling David, I thought it would be useful to do that before we move into the next panel. The next panel is a panel that will be moderated by Archana Pandya. And Archana Pandya is, as I mentioned earlier, the senior editor of Open Global Rights. And Archana, let me hand it over to you to introduce your fellow panelists and take it from there.
Thank you very much, Ram. It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you moderating the second part of this program in honor of David Petrasek, a dear, dear friend and colleague. I had the privilege and really true joy of working with and learning from David for the last several years. Together with colleagues, we worked on developing and growing Open Global Rights, which, as many of you know, is a multilingual open access online forum on human rights strategy and policy, which really aims to amplify diverse voices and bridge geographic, linguistic, and disciplinary divides through the publication of short articles by activists, practitioners, funders, and scholars. And over the years, David spearheaded the editing and curation of a wide range of content. I'm sure he solicited many of you for articles along the way. And he led series from topics related to the International Criminal Court, refugee protection, to the UN treaty body reform. In his final months and days, and as the world has really grappled with the global pandemic, he led the curation of a timely series entitled Imagining Our Post-Pandemic Futures. And this is the focus of this discussion in the second panel that we're having right now. The series hones in on the challenges and the opportunities facing the human rights community amidst this pandemic. In other words, it aims not only to address the urgent demands, but also explicitly look ahead to lay the groundwork for a better future. From healthcare, food, and sanitation to digital surveillance and heavy policing, the human rights challenges of this pandemic are many. But this shifting terrain has also created spaces for change. Demonstrations of community solidarity and the embrace of social protections that seemed impossible not long ago are now a reality. But we know, as David knew very well, that a better world will not really build itself. And as our editor-in-chief, Cesar Rodriguez Garavito, has aptly noted in his framing piece for this series, if human rights actors are to help shape the post-pandemic world, they need to start imagining it now. So this, of course, is not an easy task, especially under the circumstances. Physical distancing, economic distress, health concerns trigger fear, which naturally favors focus on the present and a longing for the past. And as some governments and corporate actors take the offensive and use the pandemic to push through anti-rights norms and initiatives, human rights actors have been doubling down on the defensive strategies and narratives. But an exclusively reactive approach risks leaving the human rights movement even further on the defensive than it was before the pandemic. And so these defensive approaches need to be complemented by forward-looking, proposal-oriented responses in the current context. And so contributors to this series offer a wealth of responses drawn from ongoing efforts by human rights actors around the world, from women's rights organizations in India to community organizers in South Africa. And I'm very pleased to say that three of these contributors, Ignacio Saiz, Alicia Iliamin, and Sol Takahashi, each esteemed human rights experts in different areas, are here today to broadly discuss discuss their ideas and proposals. And so we'll now hear from each of these speakers before turning to some questions from some of the co-sponsors and collaborators of this forum. And so without further ado, I'm delighted to hand over to our first speaker, Ignacio Saiz, the Executive Director of the Center for Economic and Social Rights.
Many thanks, Archana, and to all the organizers for the opportunity to be part of this moving tribute to David, who I had the privilege of working with very closely at Amnesty, and who was an inspiration and mentor to me as he was for so many in our community. As the previous brilliant panel has highlighted, this pandemic has brought to the surface many of the systemic inequities of our economic and social order. In country after country, we're counting the cost in lives and in livelihoods of deteriorating public health systems, precarious labor markets, threadbare social protection schemes, undervalued care work, and persistent social and economic inequalities. And these inequities are the result of decades of neoliberal economic policies, which have flown in the face of government's socioeconomic rights commitments, creating the pre-existing conditions that account for why certain communities are at greater risk from the virus and its economic fallout than others. But what's extraordinary about this moment is the extent to which so many of the myths and dogmas underpinning these policies have simultaneously been exposed as fallacies. So after a decade of austerity, we've seen that governments can, in fact, marshal unprecedented resources to invest in essential public services and sustain employment. After years of privatization and commodification of health services in the name of choice, we've seen hospitals nationalized for the public good and widespread recognition that universal access to public health is indeed in everyone's interest. After decades of excluding vast numbers of workers in the informal and gig economies from any framework of labor protections, we're now appreciating that these are the essential workers who keep our societies functioning. And after waging a long war on social welfare and demonizing those who depend on it, basic income schemes and social protection flaws that were previously thought radical are now on the agenda, as Archana mentioned. By simultaneously disrupting so many conventional orthodoxies that have held sway for decades, this moment opens up an extraordinary window of opportunity to reimagine our economies. In a context of converging crises propagated by greed, consumerism, nationalism, exploitation, and systemic discrimination, more and more people around the world are clamoring to refound our economies on a radically different set of values. Now, these alternative values are often expressed in different ways in terms of equity, fairness, dignity, solidarity, justice. I believe human rights values and human rights voices have a key role to play in advancing these demands. Now, while the economy is rarely talked about as a matter of rights, the standards of human rights, and particularly social and economic rights, have a great deal to say about what a just economy should deliver. These standards give flesh and force to the commonly held values of fairness, etc., that I mentioned earlier, in ways that can potentially be very powerful in pushing for the economic transformation needed to ensure a just recovery. But for that potential to be realized, for the human rights community to really be a more relevant actor shaping our post-pandemic futures, I believe there are three fundamental shifts in approach that are needed from us as human rights practitioners and activists. And I believe David would have very much supported these shifts in approach. Our approach must be more holistic, our approach must be more propositional, and our approach must be more collaborative. Briefly on each. By and large, human rights have not featured prominently so far in public debates around the economic impacts of COVID or economic responses to them. Indeed, where human rights have been invoked in relation to COVID, it's tended to be in terms of state overreach, the abuse of emergency security measures to limit civil and political freedoms and to quash dissent. And these are very real concerns, but surely we should also be equally concerned about state underreach. That is the chronic neglect of government's positive obligations, particularly in the sphere of economic and social rights, that has compounded the impacts of the virus. Portraying human rights only as a set of restrictions on government action, rather than as a set of prescriptions that should guide that action, risks presenting human rights as somehow in tension with effective responses to the pandemic. So it's imperative that we draw on the full range of human rights commitments governments have as we hold them accountable for how they deal with this crisis. But we'll clearly need to go beyond top-line exhortations, and we'll need to spell out in clear and accessible terms the implications of specific economic and social rights obligations for the concrete steps that governments should take, whether individually or as part of intergovernmental institutions. These duties are by no means self-evident to most policymakers. An important entry point for this over the last few months has been the economic rescue packages put together by governments and international financial institutions. And this was the focus of my piece for Open Global Rights, which came out just as the US was passing a $2 trillion package in March. Now, few governments have taken their human rights obligations into account in these interventions, many of which have been much more responsive to corporate interests than to the rights of affected communities. Yet this is a crucial moment to push for concrete budget and tax measures that break with the regressive trends of the past and are aimed at redistributing resources, reducing inequalities, and ensuring international cooperation so that countries of the Global South can also meet their resourcing needs. My OGR piece points to the constraints that these countries in the Global South face in confronting the pandemic and spells out a number of concrete measures that wealthier countries and IFIs, international financial institutions, should take, which are consistent with human rights duties of international cooperation. This includes far-reaching debt restructuring and cancellation, given that some 64 countries were paying more in external debt before the pandemic than they were paying on healthcare. But also bold tax measures, for example, taxing excess profits that are reaped by that have been reaped by tech giants over the last few months. At a time when nationalist responses to COVID are riding high and multilateralism is at an all-time low, there has never been a more pressing need to activate the principle that states' human rights duties go beyond their borders. As well as being critically relevant to shaping the immediate economic responses to the crisis, I firmly believe that socioeconomic rights standards can also provide a roadmap for the longer-term systemic shift that is needed, away from an exploitative model based on unsustainable growth towards a more resilient one based on caring for people and planet. I distinctly remember David saying when we were at Amnesty that the human rights community has always been better at saying what it's against rather than what it's for. Now, this moment challenges us to adopt a much more propositional stance, to make our community a more relevant voice in the broader conversation about reimagining our economy. But this has to be a collaborative task. We need to work in closer alliance with other movements who are also embarked on that same journey. And that includes labor unions, feminist and indigenous movements, and many sectors working for economic and environmental justice. But as after the global financial crisis, this window of opportunity to envision a rights-based economy may prove short-lived. Indeed, we're already seeing it begin to close as countries rush to return to business as usual. Building a broader base of civil society counterpower will be crucial if this opportunity is not to be lost. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ignacio, for getting us started with your comments. And we'll pass it over to our second speaker, who is Alicia Iliamin. Alicia is a senior advisor on human rights at Partners in Health and a senior fellow at the Petrie Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics at Harvard Law School. Over to you, Alicia.
Thank you very much, Archana. And as others have said, it's a tremendous honor to be part of this event and tribute to David Petrasek, who, and I think it's emblematic of how he knitted together so many parts of the human rights community and both reflective, engaged scholarship and also cutting edge activism. So I'm really very moved and honored to be a part of this. Many of the things that I had planned to say have already been said, so I will echo a number of the themes that were said in the first hour, as well as what Ignacio has just laid out, and try to say them in a slightly different way. I also believe that COVID-19, I've worked on health rights for the last 30 years. And I also believe that COVID-19 is an inflection point. It's a social and economic inflection point, as well as a global health crisis. It's also an inflection point for the human rights movement. Ignacio made 3 proposals, and mine are very similar, but phrased a little bit differently. I think that what COVID has shown in cracking open the false inevitability of neoliberal economics is, one, that human rights needs to pay more attention to political economy. 2, that we need to pay more attention to tethering rights to democratic institutional arrangements. And 3, possibly to question this dichotomy between the street and the human rights hierarchy and say, as Ignacio suggested, that we need to broaden out and work with social movements like labor movements and environmental justice movements. So first, before the COVID-19 pandemic, many of us were well aware that, as Jürgen Habermas said, liberal capitalist democracies had become mere facade democracies in many ways. And democratic responsiveness from their governments was hindered by a whole series of factors in the way administrative states were operating. Also, there had grown enormous economic inequality and injustice, even at the same time as we had gone about proliferating norms of human rights. So before the COVID pandemic, Oxfam had announced that the 200 billionaires had as much wealth as 60% of the lowest, the bottom part of the globe's population. The top 1% has as much wealth as all of the rest. So human rights has been very good at pointing out discrimination and why certain people get kept low on the social ladder. But what we have not addressed sufficiently, and I think these are questions of political economy, is why the ladder itself has grown steeper and steeper and steeper. And those egregious inequalities are also threats to democracy. But my second point is that we haven't tethered our analyses, and I'll speak about health in particular here, to democratic institutional arrangements. The right to health has been developed normatively, perhaps as much as any other economic and social rights over these years. But there have been aspects of that right, and what needs to be done for progressive achievement there, non-discrimination there, vulnerable populations. But the idea of how social determinants of health, and particularly health systems that include public health, are necessary parts of realizing health rights has not gotten sufficient attention from the human rights community. So we wouldn't, and I'll take the example of racial justice, we would not attempt to address racial injustice and police brutality without looking at reform of the police and criminal justice institutions. Similarly, the unbelievably egregious disparities along racial lines in the United States and in many other places in the health system shows that same injustice that is reflected and refracted back and exacerbated. And there are a number of reasons for that, but often in human rights, there is an acceptance of health systems as these technical apparata for the delivery of goods and services. And I think COVID has cracked that open and shown that the same kinds of normative principles of equality and dignity and justification, as Ignacio alluded to, justification of state policies need to apply to health systems. Financing, universal financing that doesn't segregate people by employment status, because we know that that is a massive wealth transfer from the middle class, a tax. And when people are left unemployed, that has knock-on effects to the economy. we know that the racial disparities in health systems and the treatment of different populations existed long before COVID and are now being laid bare. Priority setting, organization and delivery of services, et cetera. So those are all questions, and labor rights for health workers, like access to personal protective equipment. Those are all issues of health systems that are fundamental to democratic social institutions. The third thing, I think, is the idea of social movements. In my mind, the most important thing about human rights is not necessarily the important architecture of norms and institutions and procedures and the extraordinary leadership in many respects that the High Commissioners for Human Rights have shown. It is really the energy and impulse of people on the ground who we say are endowed with reason and conscience. And that reason and conscience becomes significantly less valuable if it is not used. So if there were ever a time when we all are ordinary people with all of our multiple identities need to come together in broader movements to aspire to the idea that everybody in our diversity is equal and has dignity, it is now. COVID is not going to be the last public health crisis, pandemic. We are facing climate change and other global challenges. And I'm hopeful that if we all come together, and Partners in Health is very clear that the work we do on health is linked to larger social struggles on a fairer economy and fairer social systems. I am hopeful that if we can think this through and make proactive suggestions and unite together, we can push in a progressive way, because there will undoubtedly be those forces that are pushing toward ethnic nationalism, that are pushing toward more of the same, that are pushing toward corporate bailouts, and we cannot allow that to happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alicia, for your, wow, stimulating comments. I know there's a lot of questions coming in. And now over to our final speaker, who is Sal Takahashi, Professor of Human Rights and Peace Studies at Osaka Jogakuin University. Sal, over to you.
Yes, okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear okay? You can hear. Okay,
yes,
good.
We're good.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm very honored to have been invited to speak at this event. Of course, it is a very sad occasion for me as well. I will keep it very short, but certainly David was a mentor to me, an inspiration to me, and it's no exaggeration when I say that it was really thanks to David that I started off on my career in human rights and stuck with it. It was really his guidance and his support that led me through, and that's why I'm where I am today. Whenever David contacted me about writing something for Open Global Rights or some of the other things that he was doing, I always had the sense that he wanted me to be a little bit controversial, if that's the right word. So I'll try my best with that. But several people have already noted how David had an uncanny ability to really look at the big picture. He would never lose the forest for the trees, and he always counseled me to do that as well. And as many of the other speakers have already noted, he saw human rights for what it really is, not just a set of legal norms, not just a set of institutions or administrative procedures, but part of the broader struggle, a broader struggle for social justice. And some speakers have already mentioned this, the street democracy, street movements, and the importance of linking up with other broader social movements as well. So the difficulty of being last at these kind of events is that people have already said everything that you wanted to say, but I'll try my best to say some of the issues and sort of frame them in a way that I had been thinking of. My piece on for the COVID-19 feature in the Open Global Rights blog focused on the situation in Japan and how the pandemic was being used by the government to try to push forward very sinister constitutional reforms. But because of the time constraints today, I think I'll talk a little bit less about what's going on in Japan and more about the global trends as I see them, of which Japan is just one example. I'm very happy to see the human rights implications of the past few months finally starting to be focused on. Very severe movement restrictions, the powers that some governments have jumped on the opportunity to grab detaining people, quote unquote, suspected of having the virus. The smartphone apps that are being talked about are already being used in some countries. All of these kind of issues. Obviously, I'm not saying anything which nobody here doesn't already know. I honestly believe that the focus on human rights issues was a little bit late in coming. And I think that poses some questions that we as the human rights movement need to ask ourselves. In human rights, it's drummed into us from day one that governments are the ones that are responsible for protecting and ensuring human rights. Human rights are standards enumerated in international law. And because states are the subjects of international law, they are the ones with the legal obligations. Again, I'm saying something very elementary for everybody here. Of course, some of us work on non-state actors, some of us work on corporations, but predominantly governments remain the main focus of our work. And there are good reasons for that, and good legal reasons for that, and good strategic reasons as well. This may sound like a bit of a paradox, but I think in doing this, we are showing that we actually trust, or at least we want to trust government, at least as an institution. I hope I'm not offending anybody when I say that, we tend to be liberals, not anarchists. Most of us probably aren't revolutionaries in a traditional sense. We demand that governments be open and that they be accountable to us, but we fundamentally believe in their authority. Otherwise, we wouldn't, it wouldn't make sense lobbying governments if we didn't believe that. Our buy-in to the international human rights framework means that we recognize, the government's authorities to assess situations and make certain decisions on our behalf. And I do think that showed in the COVID-19 case. All of a sudden, lockdowns, everything else all over the world. And there have been human rights criticisms of those kind of measures, and that's good, it's very important. But I felt that the criticisms tended to start with accepting the fundamental premise, accepting the premise that this was a major public health crisis. So now that we've accepted the premise, the debate becomes about whether in this situation that we've already recognized to be a major public health disaster, the measures that governments are taking are within the narrowly defined allowable restrictions in international human rights standards. So whether they have the potential to be discriminatory and whether they're proportional to the threat, all this kind of thing, which we all know here. From the outset, I kind of felt that we had already given up ground. In Japan, we say that we're sumo wrestling our opponent in his home court. That's the kind of sense that I got. Of course, I'm a lawyer. I completely understand the law and all of this, and I understand the need to be impartial and all that kind of thing. And I'm not a public health expert. I don't want to get into a debate about how serious COVID-19 is or isn't, and whether it actually warrants the kind of severe measures that we've seen. I'm not going to peddle crazy conspiracy theories. I'm not here to do that. But I do think that fundamental questions could have been and should have been raised, and I think they should be raised on these points. Unfortunately, these questions receive very little attention in society as a whole, and it was of concern to me that many people seemed to just simply accept what was going on at face value, and sort of try to chip away at some of the individual measures without looking at the broader picture. I say this because I believe it's, what's important is not necessarily each individual thing that individual states are doing. Those are important, yes. But the real point is that we're all being conditioned to accept all of these severe measures as normal. This is supposedly the new normal. You know, they're not going to go away. Just like with the war on terror, there's no end. I mean, we're already being told that COVID-19 may never be overcome, that we'll have to live with various restrictions and changes in our lifestyle for the foreseeable future. Even if a vaccine is made and found available, you know, we've seen time and time again, especially in the war on terror, how governments that extend their power in the state of exception, they don't give them up. You know, we've seen this in the United States, we've seen this in France, we've seen this all over the place. So I think that's a very sinister trend that we have to be very mindful of. Another very sinister thing that is happening is something that I've coined as the Japanification of human rights, in that we're being conditioned not only to self-police, but also police other citizens. So we're being bombarded with messages that we have to be responsible citizens. We have to practice social distancing. We have to wear masks. We have to sneeze in our sleeves. We have to do as we're told to protect others and quote unquote to save lives. We are being encouraged to treat as irresponsible people who don't comply with these instructions or question whether the lockdowns are effective or even necessary. You know, again, I'm not trying to peddle conspiracy theories, but I think these are important issues which need to be the subject of public debate. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who's noticed how peaceful demonstrators in, for example, Hong Kong, Australia, a number of different countries, they are being mentioned not so subtly as not following social distancing guidelines. You know, as if this was something which somehow, you know, argued against the entire purpose that they were demonstrating against. And I'm concerned that this is going, you know, this discourse is going to spread. I'm concerned that this is also going to start becoming the dominant discourse about these smartphone apps. You know, this is very convenient for governments. This is something, you know, they're sitting there in their offices laughing, I have to say. You know, I'm not arguing against a legal approach because it's important, but, and this is something that, you know, this is something that David would always tell me that to be careful of. Law is important, you know, law is an approach which is necessary, but it's just part of the picture. It's part of the bundle, the whole bundle. When we start constraining ourselves only to what the law says, we start getting into this tunnel vision and we start losing sight of the forest for the trees. I do think it's important that we keep our eye on the ball and make sure that we don't lose sight of the broader trends of what's going on. And to do that, you know, I just want to repeat what the other people have said. The need for linking up with other broader social movements is really imperative. Okay, that's.
Thanks so much, Saul, for that provocative intervention. And I'm sure David would have really appreciated it. So let's dive right into the questions. We have the individuals for each question lined up, but of course not planned what questions they will ask. So the first up, we have Meredith Preston McKee from the Center for Global Pluralism, and she's the Secretary General of the Center for Global Pluralism. Meredith. And
thanks, Archana. Hi, everyone. I, like many of you attending and participating today, am where I am largely because of knowing David and my engagements with David, and I'm so thrilled that everybody's with us today. I have a question for Ignacio. Ignacio, I absolutely loved your piece and your words just now. And, you know, David was, as many of us have said, such a wonderful mix of being a visionary and an optimist and a hyper pragmatist, sort of a good old fashioned cynic when he needed to be. And so that was sort of the spirit in which I wanted to pose this question to you. You've raised really compelling vision of an inclusive human rights based economic system and highlighted the importance of this being the moment where we have an opportunity to get these sorts of changes and that the window is rapidly closing. I was struck that I was even hearing some talk around the concepts of inclusive economies, of stakeholder capitalism and so forth from the likes of Mark Carney and Klaus Schwab in the last year prior to the pandemic, and wondering at the time if that was sort of window dressing or if there was any interest in real change. And as I listen to you, I feel like if David were here, he would press you on, okay, what next? What do we do with this? What do we need to do to make this happen? And how do we build maybe some new coalitions? And how can we be as convincing as possible in bridging some divides and bringing some key actors into this discussion who have the power to make real change? You noted, and other speakers have, the counter trends right now, a disastrous failure of multilateralism and international cooperation, a desire to return to normal, increase in nationalist policies and so forth. So how do we build a coalition, not just of those of us who are sort of already here, but those who maybe have the power to change and haven't been convinced, or those who feel that maybe the risks of this kind of change are too great? How do we overcome that so that we can get to the vision that you speak of? Thanks very much.
Thank you, Meredith. Great question. I think the reason why all three of us on this panel have put such an emphasis on greater linkages with other movements, other progressive movements, reflects, I think, the common intuition that the human rights movement alone is not going to be a leading actor in bringing about this change. There are many other progressive movements and forces that have been working for a long, long time in a much more propositional way than the human rights movement on what an alternative economic model and system might look like that delivers on those basic principles I talked about earlier on dignity, fairness, and values. And I feel that we've been, by and large, absent from that debate as a human rights community, and yet we have so much to contribute to it. I think another attitudinal shift that it will require from the human rights community is a certain degree of humility and modesty. Again, values that David modeled in abundance. And David did actually talk and write about this very much, how the sort of human rights supremacist approach is often very unhelpful in building alliances with, for example, the development community. I remember when we were trying to develop work on economic and social rights at Amnesty, the human rights approach was kind of preachy, evangelical almost, about our paradigm being the right one. I think in this particular context, that is a disastrous approach, and we need to find ways of dialoguing and learning from progressive economists, from development activists, from the labor unions, who really are at the forefront of this more kind of systemic struggle, around power. Human rights has been generally kind of averse to recognizing that this is ultimately around power. And I think we have so much to learn from those other movements. So I would say that's absolutely fundamental. I'll end there because I know our time is limited.
Thank you, Ignacio and Meredith, for that question. Our next question is coming from Rachel Schmidt, Senior Editor of Open Global Rights and Postdoctoral Research Fellow at the Joseph Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver. Rachel, over to you.
Thank you, Archana. David was a wonderful mentor for me in human rights scholarship, so I'm very honored to be part of this. My question is for Alicia, but I welcome any of the panels to weigh in. In your excellent piece for OGR, you specifically called on human rights actors in the global north to demand more of their governments to address global inequality and enact change on health rights, including through new transnational networks. My own research focuses on non-state armed groups that sometimes are the de facto government in weaker states or certain regions of fractured states. And now in some of these countries, gangs or non-state armed groups or other irregular authorities have actually taken the lead on COVID lockdown measures where governments have failed to act. I'm thinking of Latin America in particular, especially El Salvador and Brazil, but it's happening elsewhere as well. So my question is, what are the implications for human rights organizations in these situations in terms of building post-COVID transnational networks and potentially engaging with non-state actors on health rights and health systems?
Thanks very much for the question, Rachel. So I think your question highlights that we have an unfinished agenda in human rights and another agenda that is really pressing to adopt and explore. In terms of obligations of the North, it's not just that if we don't wear masks, we are basically saying that our behavior, we don't care about our fellow neighbors and citizens. It's also that for years and years, people in the global North have been essentially exploiting the lack of labor laws, the lack of environmental laws, the lack of protection, huge wealth transfers from the global South to the global North that we have taken for granted and has largely not been considered in human rights. Some of that is through transnational corporations and the kinds of business and human rights abuses that Mary Robinson talked about, mining and extractive industries, et cetera. But some of that is, for example, in this context, intellectual property is just an enormous wealth transfer from the global South to the global North. And there's all kinds of financial transfer pricing practices and multinational tax evasions, et cetera. Now, in terms of the non-state actors operating where there are weak or fragile or failed states, I think that is also that it's in a way a gap that has not been successfully met in human rights. But it's also because we haven't insisted that states create the fiscal space, the civic space, that they don't develop institutions adequately, whether those institutions are policing and security institutions or educational systems or health systems. So I really believe that the two kinds of agendas fit together. I don't think we can't afford any longer to separate the protections of civil liberties and from the larger material conditions that we all need to flourish as equal citizens of our countries and of the world.
Thank you so much for that exchange, Rachel and Alicia, for your response. Now over to our last question, last but not least, of course, Salil Tripathi from the Institute for Human Rights and Business. Salil, over to you.
Thank you. My question is for Sol, actually. Sol, paths barely touched one another at Amnesty, but hello from New York now. You have shown how the Abe government is using the pandemic as a rationale to bring in regulatory, legislative, and constitutional changes that can strengthen the state and undermine protection of human rights. In this, of course, Japan is not unique. You couldn't go into it in your intervention, but clearly Hungary is on the same path in terms of crackdown on dissidents. China is having this new law in Hong Kong, and of course there are crackdown on dissidents and others in India as we speak. So given that, in one of my last interactions I had with David was when we had spoken about our report on the COVID-19 pandemic and corporate responsibility towards human rights, which was to be published soon. He was very excited about it. He had seen an early draft, and in our report we had noted greater use of laws and powers by governments to restrict civil society by strengthening surveillance mechanisms. What interested him and what's been on the focus is what we do with regard to companies is given the significant impact and influence they have on human rights, and which is also a point that Mary Robinson raised earlier in her intervention, and David set us on that path with that report Beyond Voluntarism. How can their conduct be regulated better so that they can uphold rights and not undermine them at a time when states are either unwilling or unable to do so?
Sorry, I think the last part of your question cut out just for a second. You're saying, how can we support companies that are trying to do the right thing in the face of government inaction or negative action? Is that correct?
Well, kind of. What I'm saying is that the companies are in a position to do things, governments are unwilling or unable to do things, how can we shape them in the right direction? I'm not assuming that they want to do the right thing, but how can we as a human rights community shape them in the right direction?
Right. Well, as you know, and I might not have put this in my bio, but I worked for several years for the Business and Human Rights Resource Center as their Tokyo person after I came back to Japan. So I have worked very closely with companies in Japan, trying to get them to do the right thing, various different strategies, arm twisting, etc. I'm going to be really controversial here, I have to say. Because one conclusion of those several years of working, trying to convince companies, one of my conclusions was that the it benefits you approach doesn't work. It was not successful with most Japanese companies, and I'm a little bit skeptical of it. I think that when we're dealing with companies, I don't want to spend too much time here because I know that we're short of time, but I think that there a lot of advocates in a lot of countries in business and human rights have fallen into this, I wouldn't call it a trap, but I think we like to think that if we can somehow show companies that branding themselves as human rights protectors or companies that are interested in human rights, that will somehow convince them to do the right thing, we can show them that it's in their that it benefits them as well. And I and a number of, we've tried that certainly in Japan, and it was very difficult to really difficult to try to convince them. There were always reasons why the examples that we had were not applicable to their situation. There's always another excuse why it just didn't work. And so that's one thing that I feel about dealing with companies. Having said that, having spent a few minutes saying that we should never trust governments, I'm actually going to say, sort of contradict myself and say that I actually believe that the only way to do this really is to get governments to regulate companies. And I've written about this with regards to Japan and how the Japanese government tends to adopt a very sort of voluntary approach with that, gives companies all sorts of incentives to tick the boxes and make it look like they're doing human rights due diligence. And these are extremely ineffective. I think there have to be more sort of hardcore, tough approaches that really penalize companies that don't do the right thing. That in my, when it comes to companies, really, I feel that's really the only successful way, at least the way, in a sort of broad sense. Of course, there are individual and there's specific cases where it can work doing other ways, but I think in the broad sense, that's really the best approach. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saul and Salil, for that question. We are running short of time, and so I want to thank all of you, including of course our three speakers, Alicia, Ignacio, and Saul, for this rich exchange, enriching exchange, and I'm sure one that David would have really enjoyed. I personally really enjoyed how each of you brought in what David pushed you to think about, and how he pushed us all really to think outside the box, and really what the kind of the approaches that we really need to move forward through this in a way that we can actually build that future and the world of justice that we all desire. So thank you all. And for those of you who may not have explored this series, we are continuing to add contributions. I invite you to check it out, openglobalrights.org. The OGR team misses David and Will for a really long time, and he really continues to inspire us and push us on through the way that he approached even facilitating these dialogues and debates. And so OGR is one of the many places that has really been woven by his touch and is part of his legacy, really, and it surrounds us in our work and how we do it. And it's a legacy that we're committed to carrying on, and we hope that all of you will of course join us in that. And with that, I pass it back to Ram for the next and final part of the session.
Thank you very much, Archana. Thank you, Alicia. Thank you very much, Ignacio and Saul from Tokyo. Thank you for staying up this late. I just want to make one comment on the last panel and connect it to the previous one. I think one theme that has emerged from these discussions is the theme of the radical universality of COVID and also the radical inequality that has resulted from COVID-19. And when these two come into contradiction, what do we do? And how are we going to deal with this? And I think the one element, or at least inflection point, that everybody refers to as COVID-19 seems to me that in the area of economic inequality, there just might be a moment now when we can talk about democratizing the economy. Not socialism versus capitalism, but use democracy as a way of pushing forward the discussion around inequality and asking ourselves, the governments and businesses where we are, what they're going to do about this inequality that is emerging because of COVID. To me, that's the key question, at least, that came into my mind in terms of the themes that cut across these two sessions. I have the pleasure now of calling on Omar Sabri, who is a student of David Petrasek's, to say a few words. As all of you know, David spent the last decade of his life at the University of Ottawa teaching international human rights law. We missed him in Europe, in Asia, in Sri Lanka, where I am from, although he engaged with us, continued to via email and via other forms of communication. But David really enjoyed and reveled in being a professor. It brought together his love of people, his love of the world, and his love of ideas. And so it'll be very nice for all of us. And I look forward to hearing from you, Omar, your experiences as a student of David's.
Thank you, Ram. I want to start by saying thank you to the organizers of this forum in memory of Professor David Petrasek, who had such an unwavering commitment to human rights and such a sharply analytical mind that helped me understand many things in international human rights and helped me carry that understanding forward in my career. And I also just want to say briefly how struck I've been over the last couple of hours, how remarkable his humility was, because I don't remember him ever mentioning to me any of his contributions that I knew some, I knew some things about, but I didn't know, like I've heard 4 different UN human rights commissioners talk about the relationship with him, and he never once mentioned any of these contributions or accomplishments to me or in class. And so I think I would like to talk about a couple of things in the very short time that I have. Obviously, COVID-19 continues to have a devastating toll on, a devastating humanitarian toll. And I think what it has highlighted is, as you just mentioned, is the humanity of all of us. That each, it doesn't matter whether you're a prime minister or a CEO of a corporation, we all, we're all human beings and we all have the same biology and we all have the same physical limitations and vulnerabilities. And obviously, and I think, COVID has put into sharper focus, as many of us have already mentioned, existing inequalities that have existed before the pandemic struck, and in many cases has exacerbated these inequalities. And so just briefly, 3 of these things, social and economic rights. I think there was a comment in the chat function by Miloon Kothari, who I understand was the UN Special Rapporteur on Adequate Housing previously. He said perhaps this is the moment where we could finally have in the international human rights system a balance between civil and political rights and social and economic and cultural rights. And I think we can all see that in the impact of COVID-19, the sheer number of people who were on the brink. It has shown us how unjust the status quo was for so many before the pandemic struck. And so many people were catapulted into poverty, so many people who were already living in poverty, but who were just being ignored by people in power and people with more power and privilege, especially at a time of such obscene income and wealth inequality, people who don't have enough adequate housing, people who don't have access to affordable healthcare as a human right, to weather the impact of COVID-19, but of course, generally. And especially, when I talk about healthcare, especially for marginalized or more vulnerable people, like people in prisons, people with underlying health conditions, people with disabilities, and older people. The second thing I want to mention is something that that has been highlighted by the COVID pandemic is what the UN Women has called the parallel pandemic of violence against women at the time of COVID-19. The UN Women has reported 243 million women subjected to sexual or physical violence by an intimate partner in the last year. I suspect that number is much less than the real number of women who are victims of violence against women, especially in cases where they're living in confined spaces, and especially at this time of stay-at-home orders and particularly heavy-handed and maybe authoritarian responses to COVID, where many women and other people are stuck between a rock and a hard place, where they are in a confined space with an abusive partner and they can't leave their homes because of the governmental COVID responses. And lastly, racism and xenophobia. We have, that has, I think, was mentioned briefly earlier, increasing fear of the coronavirus manifesting itself in anti-Asian racism, Islamophobia in India, anti-Black racism in China, but also the structural racism in many health systems where certain ethnic marginalized groups have been disproportionately impacted by by COVID-19. And so I think lastly, I'm actually not sure how much time I have, but lastly, I just want to mention what I think Professor David Petrasek would ask us to think about as an academic and as a human rights advocate, as we think about how much the world is changing and what we can do to reinforce our commitments to human rights going forward. I think he would ask us to think very critically and carefully about the difference between the rhetoric of those who hold human rights obligations and the reality on the ground as countries emerge from the impact of COVID-19 and begin, and the rhetoric has already begun, about embarking on new beginnings on how societies will look like after COVID-19. He would, I think, ask us to think carefully about who all the actors are, and what their roles are, and what their obligations are. And I think, given his work on business and human rights, specifically on what we can all do to make sure that businesses are held accountable for their human rights abuses. I think he would also ask us to think about what we learned about existing human rights injustices through the impact of COVID-19. And what we can all do to strengthen multilateral institutions and continue to think about how they can be reformed to make them more inclusive, effective, and fair. And I think lastly, I think he would ask us to never lose sight of the fact that, never lose sight of the work that is being done on the ground by many people who do that work often at great peril to their lives and their freedom. What was referred to earlier as the street movements, and I think he would ask us to all of us to continue advocating for change to ensure that their voices are heard and that their rights are protected, and the need and the important need for us to, as an academic, I think he would keep pushing for the need for respectful, fair, and inclusive academic debate on all of these issues. And I just want to say lastly, even though he's no longer with us, I just want to say, Professor David Petrasek, thank you for everything you've done for human rights, and we will carry forward that commitment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Omar, for those touching, moving, and thoughtful comments. My job now is to thank everybody, but I'm not going to go by individual names. So I want to thank all the panelists. I also want to thank the questioners and especially the audience for their very thoughtful comments and interventions on the chats. So thank you very much. The next speaker who will conclude this webinar is Alan Rock. Alan was a colleague of David's He's currently a faculty member, professor at the University of Ottawa Law School. Before that, he was the president of the University of Ottawa. I knew Alan 20 years ago when he was the Canadian ambassador to the United Nations. And before that, Alan was also Minister of Justice as well as Health. Alan, I may have spent a bit too much time introducing you to people who already know you, so do forgive me, and over to you.
Thank you, Ram, and indeed my first words must be of thanks to all of the exceptional participants who've made this broadcast today so significant. It's timely, and it's also very memorable. I want to thank Ram Manikalingam, who presided over the flow of events as the host with such skill. I thank the distinguished present and former High Commissioners of Human Rights of the United Nations, whose participation today made this a unique program in many ways. I thank our panelists and Alex Neve and Archana Pandya for managing those very rich conversations so skillfully. Thank you, Omar Sabri, for your thoughtful remarks about David's performance as a professor and your memories of him. A word of thanks to our co-sponsors. You see on the screen, or you will, who they are. You'll note that they really span the globe. And without their help, without their support, it would not have been possible to have this broadcast today. So thank you. And finally, a word of thanks to the technical team at the University of Ottawa, to Brendan Donovan and his colleagues for making sure that all of this worked smoothly today from a technical point of view. And now in closing, permit me to say a few words about the person who inspired this program. David Petrasek, to me, was a wonderful friend and a valued colleague. He was also an inspiration. David's life was a chronology of achievement as he dedicated his energies, his scholarship, and his highly effective advocacy skills to the causes that he valued most, working toward social justice, finding ways to prevent or to stop armed conflict and violence, advancing and strengthening human rights, not in an abstract way, but through practical steps that produced real progress on the ground where the people are. You know, as we consider the state of the world today, deeply troubled, divided, lacking leadership as it faces unprecedented challenges, it seems to me that the need has never been greater for the kind of quiet but highly effective work that David did, advancing bold ideas, but with modesty and humility, aimed at transforming the world, one concrete change at a time. That is the legacy of David Petrasek and the example that inspires us to work on, each in our own way, towards the goals that he sought to achieve. You'll know that the David Petrasek Legacy Fund was established for the purpose of commemorating David's life and perpetuating his memory. It seeks to assist students both financially and by opening doors of opportunity for them through mentorships, internships, and scholarships. The David Petrasek Legacy Fund will also permit us to produce programs like today's on a regular basis going forward. Have a look at the website and see for yourself what great promise this fund holds. I encourage you to consider making a contribution in David's memory. It would be deeply appreciated, and I can assure you it will make a difference. Thank you again to all, and back to you, Ram.
Thank you very much, Alan. And with this, I will conclude this webinar. Thank you very much to all the participants. And thank you, Brendan. The webinar now ends.